I mean, with interest rates, what we're being told is lower rates lead to higher growth, higher rates lead to lower growth. Central bankers tell us every day that's why we're raising rates. We want to slow down this economy or, cool down the markets and so on. Well, what's the empirical evidence? I'd also done the first empirical test of this because it's a taboo topic. Nobody actually published a proper, careful empirical test of what is the link between interest rates and economic growth. And in many ways, nobody thought it's necessary because we all know what it is. They're telling us every day. The central bankers, the financial journalists, the textbooks, the economists, they're all saying lower rates lead to higher growth, higher rates lead to lower growth. And interestingly, and we've got all these schools of thought in economics, right? But that's where they all agree. Whether you're a classical economist, a neoclassical economist, a Keynesian economist, a monetarist economist, a post-Keynesian economist or Austrian economist, they all agree on this point. Lower rates lead to higher growth, higher rates lead to lower growth. So in many ways, everyone thought, we know this to be true. And everyone assumed that lots of tests had been done because we all proclaim this to be true. And we believe it's true. So it must be true. And there must be lots of empirical evidence in favor of this. But once you check, you realize it's not true. I realized first when I was a student, and you go through research papers when you write up, you look into a topic. And that wasn't my research aim, but often interest rates, of course, are used as the key explanatory variable. One of the explanatory variables in models, even if the model is about something else. And I remember already then noticing, it's usually hidden in footnotes. Oh, and by the way, interest rates were not significant, or in another paper. Oh, and we noticed the sign on interest rates was the wrong way round, but, sort of, okay, let's bury that in the footnote. And I saw that again and again. So I already had my suspicion. There's something hidden here. And then when I was as chief economist working in Japan, and I already discovered the key driving force of the economy is actually the quantity of credit. But what about interest rates? Isn't that supposed to be the key driving force? So then once you do the empirical tests, you realize, and so I did this study, there's 2 papers now published in peer-reviewed journals. They're both open source, so you can easily get it. One is called Reconsidering Monetary Policy, published in the quite high-ranking journal Ecological Economics. I managed to place it there because all the other journals, it's like, we can't touch this. We can't publish this. No way. This is like contradicting everything we've ever said. So I did this test. The first one was 4 major economies, US, Japan, UK, and Germany for half a century. I mean, you want to have a long time period because there's business cycles. There's also things happening. You need a long time period, quarterly data. So that's significant. And you compare nominal GDP growth and interest rates. And we looked at 2 interest rates, short rates, 3 months interest rates, and then long rates, 10-year government bond yields. And the conclusion was, and it's a very clear-cut conclusion, interest rates, first of all, about correlation. It's supposed to be negatively correlated, right? Low rates, high growth, high rates, low growth. So negative correlation, negative sign between interest rates and growth. That's not true. We found consistently over this half century in all the countries, a very strong, overwhelming result that the correlation is essentially always positive. Now, you could say, well, hang on, when you do correlation, isn't there a problem with leads and lags? And how do we do this? Well, first of all, you have to test whether you have a constant correlation actually with a constant lead or lag time, or whether it varies over time. And we found that this lead and lag time between interest rates and growth always varies. So then we use a dynamic model, and essentially we let the data tell us what is the optimal lead time. So this was a DCC Gauge model, which is the state of the art. This is the best way you can do it, where you let the data tell you. And the result was interest rates and growth are positively correlated always. So it's not true to say that, lower rates means, we now experience higher growth. It's not true. There's no empirical evidence. And what about the causation? which one causes which. And the closest we can come to this is the statistical test called Granger causality, where, famously correlation is not causation, but you can test which variable, which time series is better in forecasting the other. And you can do it both way around. And then that's what we did. And the conclusion was, well, interest rates cannot well forecast economic growth. It doesn't work very well. But economic growth forecasts very well interest rates. Right. So the statistical causation, Granger causality, is from growth to interest rates, which means the finding is totally in two dimensions, the opposite of what they tell us in the textbooks.
Right.
Instead of low rates lead to high growth, we observe high growth leads to high rates. Yes. Low growth leads to low rates. So interest rates follow growth positively, and therefore they're not useful as a monetary policy tool. And of course, that was no surprise to me anymore.
Policy making that is following market dynamics, not the reverse, right?
Exactly.
Which is obvious when you really stop and consider that policymakers cannot govern markets clearly.
I mean, of course, they always try to manipulate markets, but when you look at quarterly data in the long run, it's very clear. It's very clear. The other paper was higher frequency, monthly data, and even there we came to the same conclusion. I mean, there's a bit of variation. We also had more countries, almost 20 countries now. So there's a bit of a variation, but the ultimate conclusion is the same.
So this means that central banking, the purpose of central banking, at least the ostensible purpose of central banking, is actually impotent, right? That they're following market dynamics. They're not inducing these market dynamics.
Well, you see, interest rates are the smokescreen. This is to divert everyone's attention. It's the alibi. For example, look at the Bank of Japan. So from the early 90s, from 1991, it wanted to give the impression, we are supporting the Japanese economy. We want growth and strength of the economy and recovery and all that. So look at our rates. We're lowering rates. It's a great alibi. The central bank is really working hard. Like these guys, they were sweating in their meeting. They were meeting for 2 hours and 3 hours, and they concluded to lower interest rates by 0.25%. Wow, these are brilliant, amazing people.
Seriously, that's seriously crazy. So crazy.
It's crazy, of course. And sometimes, they meet for 2 days in a row and they have big debates. And the conclusion is they're not going to change interest rates. They stay at 0.75% or whatever.
This reminds me like when, ancient priests used to look at like the entrails of animals to decide. It's just totally arbitrary nonsense ritual.
I mean, if you step back and think about it, can it really be true that these tiny, tiny changes in these rates have this huge impact? And actually, if you do the proper test, the answer is no, because actually they always end up just following the markets.
Exactly.
And when they lean against the markets, it just usually doesn't work out. They always end up still following the markets.
Don't they also get this ability to sort of take credit for when things are good?
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. That's, of course, part of their narrative. You'll notice that whenever there's something good happening, growth, recovery, it was our wise central bank policy. There's a recession, there's a downturn, there's unemployment, there's bankruptcies. It was the government's fiscal policy. It was this structural problem. It was external shocks. It's foreign events.
Capitalists.
Everyone else is responsible. Central bank. No. We've been doing brilliant policy.
Yes, every time.
So it makes you very suspicious. But of course, the real story is, so interest rates are made out to be this policy tool so that you give everyone something to look at, because it's obvious to anyone that the central banks are powerful players. So you want to watch them. But how do you watch them? You waste your time following interest rate policies. Of course, it's true still that for one market, interest rates are important. That's the housing market, because of the usual calculations with mortgages and because ultimately it will also affect then credit availability. Because the question is, if interest rates aren't such a big policy variable, what is really driving growth? And we talked about that previously. What I found empirically and reconfirmed in further tests and on many countries is what's driving the economy is a leading variable with lead time for proper forecasting and is also causing it. You can again test the Granger causality, is the quantity of credit creation. Bank credit creation is driving it. Of course, you have to be more sophisticated. Is that bank credit creation that is used for the real economy, for GDP transactions.
Right.
And that explains GDP growth. If bank credit, that part of the bank credit that's used for asset purchases, that explains asset markets, which is also useful to forecast. And when you look at the bank credit for the real economy, you can still subdivide into credit for business investment and credit for consumption, which will be more closely aligned with inflation and therefore just nominal growth, whereas the investment is more real growth. So that's really what's driving the economy. And the central bankers don't want people to realize this. They want them to just follow their spiel with interest rates so that nobody's really holding them to account, because the fact remains, having said that, interest rates, is not the tool that is made out to be. Certainly it doesn't work the way they claim. It's still true that central banks have enormous power because of what? Because of their power over the banking system. The real force is the main creator of the money supply. That's the banks. They create normally 97% of the money supply. But what shapes their decisions is the central bank. But it may be other stuff. And it's not just straight, rates are being raised, rates are being lowered. No, it works differently. But because the banks are being regulated, that's the most heavily regulated industry. And the central bank is the most powerful institution to influence what banks doing. The mechanism is different. It's not just straight, the rates lower and higher.
There's also the implicit guarantee for future bailouts, right, that are influencing commercial banking decisions. If they think or can assume that they'll get bailed out in bad economic times, they're more likely to take larger risks.
So we have the incentive structure, exactly. We have other things. We have the profit margins that the banks can have, and that has an influence. But the straightest form, and then that is still the single most important impact on bank behavior, is the regulation. And there's ways in which central banks can regulate the banks that will encourage lending, even for particular sectors, or discourage lending and therefore credit creation. That can take a very direct form. Like in the high growth economies, they didn't want to waste time with all this propaganda and fuffing about. They just had credit growth quotas that were calculated for the economy. If we want 10% growth, we have 10% aggregate credit for the real economy growth. We split it up into by proportion of bank size, this bank this much, that bank that much. And the banks are told for the next quarter, that's your quota. You can use it or not. If you don't use it, we'll cut the quota next time. So you better, if you want to compete against the other banks, always use up your quota. And this is how it works.
That's clearly not capitalism.
That's window guidance, credit guidance. It works extremely well. And you see, the reality is, of course, every country has a lot of government intervention. Now, if you ask me, I would say most of it we should scrap, because we should have as much of a free economy as possible. But if you must have some intervention, for example, to avoid some bad things happening or to achieve a particularly important outcome that you really want to achieve, and that's ambitious, then this is the one form of government intervention that actually helps. And that is in the credit market by making sure the banks direct their credit in the right direction, the right broad areas. You don't want to do micro picking winners, but the sector of the economy, housing market versus lending to small firms. That's very important, and that's where the central bank should actually intervene. And then you could just scrap all the other rules, including actually bank regulations, which are the banks are too over-regulated, and it's the wrong stuff, which doesn't prevent banking crises. But if you make sure that banks only lend for productive business investment, you get growth without banking crises. And surely that's a desirable goal.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.